Welcome to the Dance NYC 2021 Symposium. We will be with you shortly. Today's schedule. Now we will begin our 1 p.m. afternoon sessions. At 2:30, we will have a short break. At 2:45 is the daily debrief session. Move your bodies at 3:45 with a dance break. At 4:15, our virtual expo showcases begin. And at 5:30 p.m., we'll have our keynote conversation. Accessibility. ASL interpretation and live captioning will be provided for today's session. A stream-to-text link will be posted in the chat for access to the live transcriptions. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSymp, DanceNYC 2021, DanceSymp2021, at Instagram at dance.nyc, at Twitter at dance.nyc, and at Facebook at dance/NYC. Community Guidelines. Based on Dance NYC's values of justice, equity, and inclusion, we agree to share our opinions, challenge perspectives, and engage or debate respectfully, and acknowledge and course correct if harm is caused. Honor everyone's personhood and humanity. Not tolerate speech that is disparaging, abusive, violent, or that is intended to defame someone's character publicly. Some features not to miss. Build your agenda of sessions, connect with other attendees, join community conversations, and visit the exhibitor hall. Don't forget to check out the 2021 Symposium digital program book with curated thematic guides. We are happy to be in community with you. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone. My name is Candice Thompson Zachary, Manager of Justice, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives at Dance NYC. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a non-disabled Black woman of Caribbean heritage. I am wearing a white shirt with gold hanging earrings. I have brown skin, and my dark-colored fro is pulled back. My background is a green wall with a tan woven straw mat hanging to the left. I am currently on the lands of the Lenape and Canarsie people, also known as Brooklyn, New York. And for those who are just joining us, please visit our land acknowledgement on the agenda page and share the Indigenous lands you are currently on in the chat. Personally, I'm happy that we are nearing the end of the symposium, and I'm very pleased and honored by everything that has happened over the past few days. I'd like to thank us for braving the completely digital 2021 symposium held on the HOVA platform. And of course, as you know, as we are at the mercy of technology, we want to remind you that there may be delays, sound issues, and changing circumstances that might occur during our time together. Please extend grace and patience to all of us. Second, an ASL interpreter from LC Interpreting Services and closed captioning services provided by the Viscardi Center will be available throughout the session. We will also post speaker information in the description below and under the speakers module on the left side of your HOVA web app or the menu of your HOVA mobile app. This information is also available on our website. Third, feel free to post questions or comments you want to share with the community in the chat section to the right of this event room. Dance NYC moderators, and probably me, will be interacting with you in the chat audience. There will not be dedicated time for Q&A during this discussion, But there is a session follow-up chat room in the community section of the HOVA platform where you can continue this conversation amongst yourselves. Lastly, we hope that you will help us to amplify these conversations. Feel free to repost, tag, and share your takeaways on Twitter at DanceNYC, on Instagram at dance.nyc, and on Facebook at dance/NYC using the hashtag DanceSimp. And now we're going to turn over to the session, Changing the DNA of the Settler Colonial State, Resisting the Power of Property Within the Archives. This session intends to exchange and coordinate strategies from practitioners in the fields of education, arts, archives, and data sovereignty. Our conversation will focus on the ways archives can embody change and be indigenized to reframe stories about what dance is, where it comes from, and what canon is or can be. We will examine or interrogate how intellectual property law exists inequitably in relationship with knowledge, property, and power. And I'd like to welcome our wonderful curator for this session, choreographer, director, and Guggenheim Fellow, Emily Johnson. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, Candice. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for joining us in this ongoing conversation and dialogue and work. And I hope everyone is healthy and well. Yes, really happy to be here and really happy to have these three brilliant people join me in this conversation today. Jane Anderson, Colette Montoya-Sloan, and Nicole Wallace. We'll all introduce ourselves here in a moment. I just wanted to extend my Kuyana and thank you to everyone at Dance NYC, Candice and Brenda and Alejandra and Aravel, and to you all for joining and being here. I'm Emily Johnson. As I said, I am from the Yupik Nation. I live on the Lower East Side of Mannahatta here in Lenape-Hoking, and I offer my respect and my love to Lenape people and ancestors and land and water, and hope that my work is in ongoing relationship to them and to their ancestors and to people of the Lenape diaspora, that we might together find pathways for their return to their homeland. I am non-disabled. I am in my apartment. I'm sitting low on a chair in an area that I don't usually sit at during Zoom conversations, so I'm slightly disoriented by that. I had to move because the sun shining in, while beautiful, there's nowhere to escape it in my apartment. I'm wearing a black scoop-necked tank top. My hair is down, it's dark. I'm wearing dentalium earrings, which were given to me by Jane Anderson. There is a bookcase behind me to my left and art on the walls behind me from Indigenous artists, Jim Denemy, Sonia Kelleher-Combs, Andrea Carlson. And I'm noting that this recording is airing on March 20th. We recorded previously. And I'm in a time where stress for me personally is really high. Work is really fast. Support is also really high, and solidarity is really strong. And that makes all of my emotions also very high. And I think that will be transparent in our ongoing conversation, and you can probably already hear it a little in my voice. So I am doing my best to be fully present here, while I also know that a little bit of my attention is being called elsewhere. So I just want to acknowledge that. And now I'd like to bring everyone else forward, and also thank our ASL interpreters, Emilio and Mike, and also Michelle for captioning. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colette Denali, Montoya-Sloan. I am an archivist and librarian in Lenape-Hoking, New York City. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a non-disabled Indigenous woman from the pueblos of Isleta and San Felipe in New Mexico. I'm wearing a navy blue shirt with constellations. My hair is dark and pulled back. I'm wearing beaded blueberry earrings by Bronwyn Butterfield from Treaty 1 in Canada. My background is a white wall with lots of shelves covered in pens and notebooks with prints from Nikki McClure and Jess X. Snow. Nicole, do you want to go?
Aning bonjour, Nicole indigenized, Makonin Dodem, Kakavakong in Donjaba, Canarsi Minoa Lenape-Hoking in Danungum, Jaganash Minoa Anishinaabe, Indinoe Maganag, Nagachuanang, and Jinjabawag. Meet you. Thank you, everybody. My name is Nicole Wallace. My pronouns are she, they. I identify as a non-disabled mixed race person of European ancestry, and I'm also a descendant of the Fond du Lac band of Lake Superior Chippewa or Ojibwe from Minnesota. I currently live on Canarsie and Lenape territory in so-called Brooklyn, New York, and I am wearing a black turtleneck with beaded earrings. My hair is down and it is dark and long, and I am sitting in front of two shelves that have books on them, and a wooden file cabinet is behind me with a tall lamp, and then to the other side I have another shelf with various jars. I'm really happy to be here today, and I want to extend my gratitude to Dance Nyc and also to Emily for inviting me to be a part, and also to Colette and Jane. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Jane Anderson. My pronouns are she, they. I identify as a non-disabled white person of Australian heritage. I'm wearing a red and black halter neck with silver earrings from a Maori designer. I'm pretending it's summer, which is why I'm wearing a halter neck. My background is a grey filing cabinet with books behind me. I'm here in Mannahatta, Lenape-Hoking, and I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the ancestors and to the present and emerging leaders of these lands and waters. I'd like to thank Dance NYC and Emily, and excited to have this conversation with Colette and Nicole and Emily. Thank you.
So we're going to move forward together in conversation. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we are in continuous dialogue together. So this conversation has been happening for months and years prior to this coming together. So you all are joining us at this moment, but this is one moment in a continuum. So I just want to acknowledge that. And we're really in an open conversation. We have stories to share with one another and you, as well as questions and projects and values and ideas and solutions to share with all of you too. Yeah.
So we decided that we wanted to begin by sharing with all of you stories from our experiences with archives. Jane, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I guess I wanted to begin with a story that happened on a cold New York morning in 2016 with a colleague and friend of mine, James Francis, from the Penobscot Nation in Maine. And we were bundling out of the subway at 81st Street, and we were going to the American Museum of Natural History. And we were going there to look at Penobscot collections, and I had been in the museum I think the week before with some of my students, and we'd been in the halls of the Northwest Coast and the top story where the Eastern Woodland, Hall of the Eastern Woodland Indians were, and I'd asked my students to stay a little longer than they wanted. They were very uncomfortable in the space with the dim lighting and the stiff mannequins and the inaccurate and misleading labeling, but I wanted my students to stay just a little longer in that kind of uncomfortable space and to think about how that made them feel in a different way. And as I turned around, I found myself looking at some chief cuffs and collars that were on a mannequin, and I looked down at the label, this little tiny label that said Penobscot. And so after that, I called James to say, do you know about this collection? And he didn't really know much about it, interestingly, even though Penobscot collections are held in over 40 institutions nationally. And he has spent a lot of his time trying to find those collections within archives, libraries and museums. And he's done a lot of that work partly because Penobscot don't legally own any of those collections. They've either been, they were either collected by anthropologists or education workers or missionaries or church workers, and then donated into these institutions. And so Penobscot haven't had a lot of opportunities to be connected to those collections. And so there's a lot of work happening to reconnect to those collections. And so when James came down, we went into the service elevator at the American Museum of Natural History and went up to the fourth floor and went into this kind of area of modular horizontal storage systems, and kind of started to open the section that was within the larger Wabanaki cultural designation in the museum. And there were ash baskets and canoe paddles, and bows occupied the different kinds of shelves. There were sweetgrass combs and engraved pipe bowls and stems and charms and engraved basketing and knives and powder horns and whistles and children's games and wampum. There was trap scent and birch bark containers, and there was just an enormous collection of Penobscot material in that space that was sitting next to each other but had not been touched by a Penobscot person in a really long time. And so as we were talking together, James started to pick up the pieces within that were in the modular shelving and started talking to them and started identifying whose family they belonged to and the different relations. And so in this kind of moment of reconnecting to these collections, they became very clearly more than just objects, as the way they'd been described within these spaces is largely as objects. He was activating a relational dimension to them and kind of awakening them in a different kind of way. We had to wear gloves to touch all of the material because they had a lot of it had been treated with preservation chemicals, which didn't allow us to touch them with our hands. We had to kind of wear gloves as a kind of intermediary part of engaging with the collections. And I think what was really interesting was just the way in which in that moment, you know, opening up the archive, opening up the walls of the modular system and holding and touching and engaging was just physically reactivating relationships of kin and community in the warmth of his hands. And when we were done there and done speaking to those relations there, we kind of tracked back to the hall of the Woodland Indians, and he really wanted to see the chief's cuffs and collar. And so we went back into this really dimly lit room, and we kind of got to the case that was holding the chief's cuffs and collars. We're kind of trying to stare in there to try and understand how to get in there to kind of touch it, but we couldn't get into touch. And then James just said under his breath, I have a photo of someone wearing that. And for me, that is just a story that illustrates some of the dimensions that I think we're going to be talking about today in relationship to what it is to be within colonial archives, the different kinds of violences that make those spaces, and how that gets continued into futures, and what it takes to resist and rework those spaces in ways for Indigenous sovereign futures.
Thank you for sharing that, Jane. Colette, do you want to share your story next?
Of course. My story is a different story. I'm lucky that I work also in the Lesbian Her Story Archive. It's a brownstone in Brooklyn, and it's a community-run archive by and for people who identify with the word lesbian. So it's a pretty broad community. But at that role, I'm an audio archivist. So I work digitizing this collection of about 3,000 audio cassette tapes. And they range from oral histories to old radio shows that might mention the word lesbian somewhere in there. There's music, there's even a tape of someone's performance art where it's just werewolf howls for about 45 minutes. So that's a favorite of mine. But I've been there about 10 years. And throughout that time, people have always asked me, well, how do you connect your heritage as someone who's Indigenous to, this queer environment? And I've always thought, well, we're everywhere, so there's got to be something, but a lot of the collections at the archives are unprocessed. There's this kind of trope that researchers go in and like discover things in archives, but I want to dispel that by the time things are processed, somebody usually knows what's in there. But I was working on these tapes. It was pretty late at night. In the summers, I would sometimes stay till 3 in the morning at the archives because it's a safe community. It's a house. And we actually have a caretaker who lives on site in an upstairs apartment. So it always feels very cozy and like it's part of my community. And it almost feels like I'm at a second home when I'm there. So I was there very late at night. I had a cup of tea in my mug and I was listening to tapes. And some of these tapes are labeled in very illegible handwritings because people would just record these cassettes and then just scribble on them, not thinking that anyone would ever listen to them or that they might relabel them later more legibly. And it was from an at-home. That's what the Lesbian Her Story Archives calls their events that occur at the archives, just like the Lesbian Her Story Archives at home. And it was a recording of Paula Gunn Allen. Paula was a mixed race Pueblo and Lakota person. I'm also Pueblo. So when I heard that introduction, I was really taken aback. And I immediately, before she even started speaking much, was tearing up a little bit and had this like strange, tight, but also butterfly feeling in my body that I knew I was listening to one of my ancestors speak. So Paula began to read her poetry, and she read about water and the relationships that water brings us all, because water connects everything in relation with each other. And by the time I had finished this tape, I felt this immense sense of renewal, but also loss that the tape was over. And I knew that she had passed, but that I had this opportunity because I had this tape in my hand that I could listen to her over and over again. And I've actually been very fortunate that I've been able to have Emily and Nicole visit me at the archives and listen to the tape with me. And I've digitized the tape, and whenever people ask me, like, what's your favorite thing in the archive when I'm doing little talkbacks, I try to tell that story, but maybe not in the same way, because it's very meaningful to me. And outside of Indigenous spaces, I think people just think, oh, she's connecting to someone that like she has a connection with. This is a cool little anecdote. But for me, it was more than just a little moment. I suddenly felt this is a person, this is one of the first queer people I've ever encountered from my culture, and I'm encountering them through a cassette tape. And I had very mixed feelings about it because I didn't know if it was a sense of loss or a sense of hope. And I feel that a lot in archival spaces. Nicole, would you like to share?
Sure, thank you. That was really beautiful, Colette. I feel like our stories have a lot of parallels. I work as a managing director at the Poetry Project, and I've been there now for a little over 10 years. And before I started working there full time, I was in library school, and I was on the archives track. Colette and I actually went to Queens College, but just overlapping at the very end of mine and the beginning of Colette's time there. And when I was there, I focused on audio archives, specifically recorded sound, pre-electric recorded sound. So I had an internship at the Rogers and Hammerstein archive at NYPL. So that was kind of like my area of interest. And then I ended up working on an oral history project for the Poetry Project as kind of like my final capstone project at Queens College. And then I guess this is kind of a long story, but all important and relevant information. So a few years ago, I guess all of this is to say that I'm primarily a poet, and I am a poet, arts administrator, and also somebody who went to school for archiving. And a few years ago, I had heard of this poet. Her name was Diane Burns. She is also Anishinaabe, like myself. And she lived in New York City from the late 70s and had passed away in early 2000s, I think 2006, maybe the end of that year. Anyhow, I had just heard of her poems. There were 2 recordings online of her reading her work. One was a short video produced by Bob Holman, who's a poet, and very brief, 1 poem. And then there was another video of her reading at an open mic at AICH, the American Indian Community House. And that was it. There were a few poems that you could find online, but her one and only chapbook, Writing the One-Eyed Ford, had been long out of print. So there was really like no other points of access for this work. And some people who had the chapbook, it's in library collections, but it's just like not easily accessible. This is also around the same time that I started writing in Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe language, and started to bring that into my own poetry and writing work. So all of this is happening. So I'm like, okay, the Poetry Project, we have this archive. It goes back to 1966. We've recorded every single reading that's happened here. The archive itself went to the Library of Congress in 2006. So we haven't had it on site, and it hasn't really been digitized. But then suddenly there was this shift, and there was a whole part of the archive that had just been digitized. So I found in our database that we have on site, I was like, Diane Burns, and she had 2 readings that popped up from 1981 and 1982. So around the same time as Writing the One-Eyed Ford came out. So I was like, okay, time to write to the Library of Congress to see if they have this digitized, because there's only a certain number of recordings that had been digitized at that point. So they got back to me and they had the recordings, and it's hard to describe the feeling of listening. Like Colette also explained, it's there was something about hearing Diane read these poems, to hear her personality come through on the tape, that is something that is outside of the print record. Like you can't get that from a published print work. Not that I had access to that anyway, but hearing her read the poems and go like there were a few poems that I had heard from the other recordings, but a lot of it was brand new. And hearing, you know, Diane also incorporated the language into her writing. So hearing that and feeling like there's just, I didn't know that there was another Anishinaabe poet who came through the poetry project, which is like, you know, an oversight on my end, but it just felt like so powerful to connect with that. Having been there for so long, I started interning at the Poetry Project in 2007. So just being there for this whole period of time and not knowing who Diane was until this very point, and then realizing that her work had been there the whole time. And that kind of just opened up a lot of different things. Like, what are the possibilities of connecting to ancestors or relatives in the archive, and what resonances are there to connect with? And yeah, so I'm thinking about that, and that's what brings me into this conversation. So
thank you, Nicole. I'm just thinking about how each of your stories so far, and I think what I will share too, are really ways in which we are seeing and then finding ways through the colonial logics and legacies in an archive, right? And there's specific things to counter and to dismantle those legacies, as we'll discuss in terms of decolonial and indigenized archive. I'm just thinking of those relations. I think, yes, in our prep call, I think, Jane, you said, and we talked about, like, the decolonial archive is an archive of relations, right? And we'll talk more about that. And I guess I think of that because what I will share first is that I'm learning so much from you three. And I'm really appreciative of this learning space and this ongoing learning. And also to give you viewers the context that Colette and Nicole and I are working on creating an Indigenous digital archive of relations in the context of my dance work, with the material that is currently housed digitally at Maggie Alassi National Center for Choreography. So a lot of our conversations and our discussions will be put into practical planning ideas coming forward. So I think about that in relation to all of this too. And what I'm going to share starts with being at the, I think it was the Burke Museum on Duwamish land in what is called Seattle, with my friend Sven Hackinson, who was the previous director of the Alutiiq Museum in what's called Kodiak. And knowing who I am, he brought me to visit our masks, Yupik masks. And I don't think this is an exaggeration. Jane spoke of those stacks and those drawers and those cabinets, and you know, you kind of like shimmy in, but then he opened up the it's almost like you open up a wall and then you open up a drawer. And to me, in my memory, I was standing there and it was like, as far as my eyes could possibly see were masks, were my ancestors. And since before that and since then, I've stood on tundra where those masks are meant to stay. And when you stand on tundra, when I stand on tundra, I can see as far as my eyes can see. Like there's no interruption, right? Because there's no interruption of that landscape. It goes on and on and on. And so in my experience now, those two experiences are conflated into one. It's like when I stand here remembering standing there with Sven and meeting my ancestors, in that particular place at that particular time, it's like I am standing on the tundra and they are extending beyond where I can possibly see. And Colette talked about this hope and loss, and those masks are not meant to be in that drawer. Our masks are meant to be danced, and then they're meant to be left on the tundra. And so to me, the place where they are meant to be meets the place where they are held in captivity now. And the most recent time that I've stood on the tundra was outside of the village called Quinnahock, with relatives, with friends, with people I had just met, residents of Quinnahock, and we were there as part of a celebration. And this is a very long story, which I will just offer you the tiny bit of, which is that over the course of the last more than decade, there's been an archaeological dig outside of Quinnahock. And community members and invited relatives of community members, such as myself and other Yupik artists, have been invited to be there and be part of the process of meeting our ancestors. And through this archaeological dig, and every one of our ancestors are remaining in Quinnahock, and so I've seen kids and elders not only like in relationship to the objects in the that our ancestors directly made, but also like some kids like figuring out, oh, where does a labret go on your face, you know, and like that relationship from the hands of our ancestors making an object to like the chin of a little kid in Quinnahock, like figuring out where that labret goes, you know, and then when I think of that makes me think of what Jane was talking about the speaking to and the speaking with, like, you know, the belongings that we're speaking of are related, right? They're related to one another, they're related to us, they're related to our future, they're related to our past, as well as our knowledge, as well as our dances, the things that don't necessarily produce maybe an object. And I think about archive too as like, so this is a fishskin lantern that I made in order to make this dance called Nichugni, which, you know, so in holding this lantern and in knowing this fishskin, so my father hooked this fish, I reeled it in, I cleaned it, my dad helped me, reminded me the steps. I scraped the skin and sewed the skin together. This along with 49 other lanterns have been part of an ongoing tour and offering of Nichugni, the dance and the stories of that dance. To make this, I had to learn first because I didn't know how to work with fish skin. And so I learned from Audrey Armstrong, who's Dene, D-E-N-E. And she's a fish skin basket maker, and she taught me and my mom over the course of days and others who were at the workshop to make this fish skin basket. And then she told me that I can, once we know how to work with the skin, we can make anything we want. And so I made up this idea of the lanterns, and then I invited, you know, multitudes of people to help make lanterns with me. And so we had the fish, and then we had the scraping of the fish. And the first time when I was scraping this and this basket, my grandmother lent me my great-grandmother's ulu, her ulu to the tool to work with. And so I was connecting like the making of these with also the work of my great-grandmother from the past, and then the future work of people I had yet to meet who are going to make the rest of these lanterns in not a short and not easy process. It takes days to make these, you know, and the labor to make these, and then the relationships that continue from making those lanterns. I was then, you know, back in Alaska with another project, a quilting project, and Audrey was there again, who had taught me the fish skin lanterns, and like just the ways in which our relationships grow and depend on and feed one another. I'll just finish with the quilt project brought us to tour in what is called Chicago. And as I was leaving in 2019, as I was leaving on my way to the airport, I went to the Field Museum because a colleague of ours, Deborah Yepapapan, had invited us over the course of time to be sewing some of the quilts there and to activate our project and our relationships in context and in counter to the Field Museum. And the Field Museum has a hall, I forget the official name of the hall right now, but they use the E word all over in their displays. And Deborah and I had joked on previous visits that I just wanted to take a Sharpie and cross out that E word everywhere that it was, because I mean, it's kind of relentless. And she was like, well, let's do that. And what we ended up doing was using tape. What's the tape? Gaffer's tape, using gaffer's tape. And so on my way to the airport, we went to the field, and along with Deborah, I covered that offending word over and over. And then I wrote this statement, which I'll just share with you, which is, when I walk into this hall, I greet my ancestors. And this is my first priority. And then I want to break them out of these cages. Every ancestor, every belonging here needs to be sung to and fed and talked with and prayed for and healed in a different way. I do not know all the ways. I do know every ancestor, every one of our belongings needs to be sent home. I also know the E word hurts my ears, and it hurts my heart, and it hurts to see it written so many times in this hall. I want for my ancestors here, for my people who come into this hall, for those of you who are non-Indigenous too, to be relieved of bearing the violence, the racism, and the hurt of seeing, hearing, and feeling this made-up word that was forced upon us and continues to be forced upon us in settler colonial spaces such as this one. I am Yupik. We call ourselves Yupik. Every ancestor, every belonging in this hall comes from a specific people, a specific part of the world, a specific ground, a specific land, a specific culture, a specific language. These are the names we need to see, hear, and feel in this hall, the names that we choose for ourselves.
Thank you, Emily.
Yes, thank you, Emily.
Emily, thank you so much. And I think the connections across the three or the four stories really talk about, I guess we're really centering relations and relationships. And when you said before, Emily, that the decolonial archive is an archive of relations, just by centering that in what we've been saying, kind of starts to, think through the different trajectories that we want to go to. And I guess I want to just pick up on one thing that you said and just tie it a little bit into the title of this session, which was how names matter and how much names matter. And what we find within museums, archives, and libraries is a colonial erasure of those names. And so much of the work is to bring those names back, but in bringing names back, bringing bodies back, bringing people back, and bringing them home as well, right? So these kind of connections. And so there's a certain kind of temporal part to that as well, this kind of connections between pasts, presents and futures, but not in linear ways, in differently assembled ways. And I guess I would love to hear from Nicole and Colette just a little bit about these. I think we can think about all these different forms of violence that happen within these spaces, but one that kind of jumps to mind is the project of classification, the project of ordering Indigenous knowledges through non-Indigenous frameworks of meaning. And thinking, so, you know, an object is an object, a song is a song, a photograph is a photograph, words are language, and often within archives, all these pieces are segmented out. There's a breaking of those relationships in certain kinds of ways. And I guess I've got a question about how we could work to decolonize and indigenize classifications and categories within archives and libraries and museums, and what that might look like for a different kind of archive.
Jane, I'm really excited that you brought up this topic. One of the blessings of the digital world during this pandemic is so many different experiences that normally would be in person that we couldn't access. I was actually part of a training on the Brian Deere classification system, which is a classification system for Indigenous languages and worldviews. And I'm embarrassed to say that even though I've been in the library field for a little over 10 years, I wasn't aware that this existed. I went on an interview some time ago where I was asked, like, oh, you're Indigenous, so what can you tell me about Indigenous classification systems for cataloging? I was like, what? I was really taken aback, and I started to research them, and then realized that I had no way of accessing practitioners of these classification systems in an easy way. So I was really fortunate to attend this training, and it's really made me think about this kind of interplay between, or this false binary of sacred and profane, right? Because I was taught that all things are sacred, but at the same time, I've seen museums, archives, libraries take sacred things and make them profane in a way. And I guess where I'm going with this is also an experience at the Field Museum. I was a child. I lived in Wisconsin for quite some time, and my family used to take me down to the Field Museum, to see Chicago, but also to visit with our ancestors, who are embodied in the things they created at the Field Museum. And there were things there that, although I wasn't aware of it, shouldn't have been seen even by people in our own community at certain times, but they were just on display. And I wish that when they had been taken, there had been something written into the notes of the classification saying, like, these should not be on display. They shouldn't have even left our community. They should be rematriated. But the classification systems, they're written to describe things and not in a very specific way. When I was in graduate school, and I am actually very mournful that I didn't get to meet Nicole, because we did overlap for this period of time, and I feel my life could have been enriched by their presence for so much longer. But when I was in school, I took a class on museum registration and labeling, and it just seemed so sterile in a way. And since I took that class, I've been more aware of classification and more aware of the labeling in different institutions that I visit. I don't think I really have a point with this, just that I need to be more aware. We all need to be more aware of these things. And I think about how our ancestors are living in these institutions all over the world, in some cases trapped. They're in captivity, as Emily said. I think about the European institutions that are refusing to release things to rematriate, even when it is nations themselves trying to repurchase their own belongings. And it's a sense of loss, a great sense of loss, more than I can describe, really. And that all ties into the classification of things as objects and not as relatives.
Thank you so much, Colette. I wish we would have known each other too. But what a gift to be able to know each other now and to be working together on this. It's definitely like this project with you and Emily has brought my attention back to archives in a way that I'd really been missing. But to go off what you were saying, when Emily read the statement there, I wrote, I just took a quote. Our relatives should be sung to, fed, talked to, and healed in some way. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about what you're saying, Colette, that these objects, these ancestors were ripped away from our communities and then put in these institutions where then they're further dehumanized and stripped of relationships by using these different types of language and categorization systems, like the controlled languages and vocabularies that are used, that are, they are not maybe the indigenous language way of describing something. Like in Anishinaabe, a rock is animate, a tree is animate. There's not a correlation to the English language that relates animacy or inanimacy. And in Anishinaabe language, there is no gender. It is animate or inanimate. So I'm thinking about the way even just like if there was a rock, let's say in a museum and it's labeled rock, you still wouldn't even understand that that is still a relative, that is an animate thing in the language. And just like how that in and of itself is a violence. And we were reading this Robin Wall Kimmerer essay on the service berry, and Emily and Colette and I were talking about it, and there's a difference between something that is an object and then something that is like a gift or a relative, because those things have inherent relationships that connect, right? Whereas an object is stripped of any kind of animacy or any kind of relationship. So those are the things that I'm thinking of after Colette spoke. So
I really loved reading that essay with the two of you, and I hope, Jane, that you can read it too if you haven't yet. But we met, the three of us, recently, and after having read that essay, I got to see Dr. Kimmerer speak, and it really relates to what Nicole said, where Dr. Kimmerer was talking about how by using this inanimate pronoun it, we're stripping our relatives of their animacy and of their life being. And I think that's what a lot of classification and labeling systems do.
Thinking of relations, of relationship, of what you both just shared, and the livingness and the ongoingness, right, of knowledge and of resonance. And Nicole the other day made this point as we were talking about dance, and as we were talking about like you have maybe an experience with performance and certain resonances and relationships built from there, which meet other relationships and resonances which meet others. And when you strip away and kind of codify and house material, knowledge, objects, belongings, when you strip it from those relationships and those resonances, you're creating and activating harm, and also preventing future resonance and relationships, right? Like, or harming them or impacting them in some way. And I think about that. Like I think of artists' archives, for example, and how if a focus on I think about the the logics of extraction, of holding, of removal that we're speaking of, the settler colonial logics that have created many of the archives and many of the archival systems that we live near with under. And so in changing that, there is, and in a focus on relationship, there is also a question about the challenge of individualism, right? Like how can an artist's archive also be in relation with people who have been part of that process of making and sharing that work? And then also, how are we, like, in this moment of, you know, we're creating an archive right now of and not only in this particular Zoom call and on our sharing of this knowledge and our stories and our experiences, but the millions of Zoom calls that have happened in the last year, like in terms of the future and in terms of creating archives that support a future and not just preserve a past, how do we not recreate the same kinds of mistakes? What are we doing now with all of this material, with all of this knowledge? How are we not just falling into those steps of like push record to make sure you save it and then you stick it somewhere and you extract what you need from it later? Like that's actually just a repeat, right, of that harm. And like, and I think of so there's that. So there's that question. How can an archive be a place for supporting futures? But also in that, and specifically for this dance context, and like, I love this question, Jane. Can archive be a place? And it's what we're speaking to, a relationship, an ongoing resonance. Can archive be a place of temporal sovereignty, right? Where linear time is not the dominant way of structuring relationship.
I think I asked that question as we were on the back of the conversation that we'd had the other night together, in terms of thinking about how does a linear idea of time condition meaning? How does it shape what we think we know about something? And what does it mean to create alternative relationships to time, where pasts are presents and presents are futures? And what would that kind of reorganization, or that kind of like at a mental level, as well as a physical level, as well as a relational level? And I kind of think about, I was really struck by both Colette and Nicole's beginning stories around sound and around hearing, like around voices, and how potent and profound voice is as a connector, as a piece that pulls pasts into presence immediately. And I've been doing some work over the last couple of years with Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine around the 1890 sound recordings, these first sound recordings that were ever made on native lands. They were made in Calais, Maine. They were made on Penobscot homelands, but then they left Passamaquoddy homelands. They left Passamaquoddy homelands and didn't return for another 125 years. But when Passamaquoddy heard their ancestors, it was like they were there. They were there. They were there that day, and they were there the next day, and they were there the next day as well. They were actually, you know, and they're there for the future. And so in many ways, that project was not only about making sure that those connections to those sound recordings were activated properly back with the community whose ancestors were recorded, whose voices were recorded, but also changing the catalogue in the Library of Congress in relationship to how those recordings were known, not just as the researcher who had recorded, and this kind of gets to partly what you were talking about, Emily, in relationship to what is the desire to constantly accumulate and possess and record and document? Where does that come? What is that, and what is that in response to? And can we hold ourselves just away from, like, think about that for a moment? But also then what happens when it's the non-Indigenous person, or the person who is doing the recording, becomes the rights holder of those recordings and becomes embedded in the catalogue forever as the rights holder and as the author and as the owner of those recordings. And what foundational shift needs to happen to change that organizational ordering? So it's Passamaquoddy names, it's Passamaquoddy language, they're Passamaquoddy. They always were and always will be Passamaquoddy songs. They're not anybody else's. But how does that get recognized within those spaces? And what kind of shift is required to do that? But what then happens in relationship to meaning and relationships through that kind of change as well? And so for me, sound is such a great illustrator of the potential of temporal sovereignty.
I think it's about rematriation in a way, and in many ways, that we have to return things to where they belong in terms of classification and in the physical sense of it. I was really fortunate to work on an article with an anthropologist from the University of East Anglia, and they insisted on including me as a co-author, even though I was the subject of the interview. And I think that for me was a form of rematriation. And then this anthropologist actually encouraged me to co-present with them on my homeland, in Tiwa land in New Mexico. And for me, that was the kind of relationship I want to build if I'm going to be working as an informant. But it made me think about, there's so many stories of loss, and I don't want to keep bringing them up because I think it can be a bit dour in a way. But also at the American Museum of Natural History that Jane mentioned earlier, they have the remains of many of my ancestors, but in particular, ancestors from Chaco Canyon, which is one of our most sacred places. We believe that many important things happen there. And my people feel such a strong connection that when I am there, I can literally feel my feet aching when they touch the earth there. But the museum decided to DNA test these remains to see what relations they could determine between the different peoples who they were holding in captivity that they had removed from the ground and are still holding there even now, because they claim that we as Pueblo nations, as the people of the Southwest, could not prove a lineal descent, and that they had the right above our right to study the remains of our ancestors. And they found things that were amazing. Yes, I was stunned by some of the things they learned from this DNA testing. But at the same time, that was not their knowledge to take. And that, I think, is almost like an ultimate settler colonial act, is to take even our blood, even our bodies, and to break them down into small sample sizes and codify them and classify them with these like DNA sequences of these like A's, T's, C's, G's, so that we're no longer a full people, but we're just a series of codes. And I want to break away from that and say that we don't have to do that. That doesn't have to be the goal. We don't have to have this like Linnaean drive to classify everything, because what we should be doing is returning everything to in relation with each other and putting it back in its context where it belongs. And I think that's something that I've been lying awake thinking about, which sounds a little dramatic, but I was thinking about Emily's work and how I think that part of our project with Emily is that there has to be some kind of homecoming. And what is our home? What is our home as people of mixed ancestry? as people who are Indigenous and settler descendants. But I think that I personally feel that if I had an archive of my own work, that I would want it to go home sometimes and have caretakers specifically meant to come and breathe life back into these things that have been reduced to objects or to recordings. And I just want to continue this question that Jane has asked, but also to ask Emily, like, how she feels about home, this concept of home, and as related to archive as well.
That is such a gorgeous question and so huge. And that thought that what you just, I can't fully speak to it now because it's like it's sending a lot of energy through my body, that this thought of creating pathways for what we create now and archive now, that it can, that in futures it can also return home. Like how do we create, like is that the is that the most important thing? Like, is that one of the most important things to create that pathway for homecoming, as you say? And what is the home concept of home as related to archive? You know, the other day, not the other day, it was months ago now, actually. Joseph Pierce, M. Pierce, who is citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Karen Recollet, urban diasporic Cree, and we were talking, and we were talking about other things, and then we started talking about archive and in like a confluence of ways. And I've been doing a lot of work lately with in partnership with Karen, and thinking about collaborating with trees, and in thinking about about collaboration with more than human kin, specifically with Karen and I, that is in relation to fire and trees. And just through this conversation then, and as I've shared, I think with all of you, like we said together, or I think Joseph just said the words, but like we started talking about breath, and we started talking about sharing of breath and respiratory of human beings and of tree beings. And then I think I asked, like, oh wait, do trees, we're talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide and this cycle. And then Joseph, I think, said, the forest is an archive of our breath. And I guess that's what comes to mind first when you ask that, what is the concept of home as related to archive? That comes to mind first, and I have to think about it much more. But this return to breath, which now is relating to sound again, and is related to effort, it's related to labor, it's related to knowledge, it's related to the atmospherics, to what we share, again, not only with one another as human kin, but with our more than human kin, all the way to the celestial, to the below ground, and so this breath and this relationality between and with breath, and where our work and our makings and our futures, where they come from. And yeah, how do we support that all of that coming home? How do we support the concept of what is shared amongst us that is home? What is specific, like I say in that statement, what is specific culturally, and what is specific in terms of a landing place, but also what is shared. It's a beautiful question.
I love that too. It makes me think of something we were talking about the other day, which is how, specifically around the dance archiving, like how, but I guess it can fit any kind of archive too, but how do you infuse the archive with community? And I think it's like thinking about like the different constellations and networks of relationships that exist is one way, but then like with dance, for example, there's, from a non-dancer perspective, there's a choreographer, and then there are dancers, and then there's a performance, right? And there's maybe sound or music, something else that's happening in the environment. So there are all of these different pieces. So for each performance, there's a different experience that somebody there has, whether they're sitting over here or over there, and that no two performances will ever be the same. So how do you create a space for that to come alive in an archive? What does that look like? I don't have the answer, but I think it's what we were talking about the other day, and maybe feeds into the idea of what home might mean in terms of the archive.
I wonder too, not only can archive be infused with community, but I also wonder about how archive can build community. I thought I shut that off. I don't know how. Yeah, how can archive build community, and what, you know, as every, I'm really thinking about this home, and I'm really also now thinking about mutual aid, and about and about concepts and archives, or concepts and ways of care.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think this concept of care is so important, and it's kind of an ethics of care as well. But I mean, I think about how we grappling with what the problems are, and like, you know, the importance of naming them in order to kind of find different kinds of pathways. And this profound problem of the assumption that the archive is a finite home in the first place, right? That so many relations were taken from homelands and put into a museum, archive, or library as the final home, right? There was no concept that there would be a return. There was no concept of rematriation. That is a new concept, and as if there was a foreclosure, a closure of that possibility for rematriation, and kind of for a connection back to lands and the homelands and the waters and the skies, where the knowledge, where the relations sit safely, right? So then there's kind of a question about safety within these spaces too, which I think you actually spoke to in a different way earlier, Emily, when you were talking about your experience in the Field Museum. It was not a safe place for you or for all the relations that are there either. And so care, safety, home, they all seem to be like, what is it if an archive is created with this potential for ongoing travel backwards and forwards to homes in that multiple, rather than being, in one singular place, which is the construction of and we know that this is also true for particular kinds of relations that are spread across institutions and aren't ever to be reconnected. And so that separation, it's not even only a classificatory project of segmentation, it's a physical work of doing that through, again, certain kinds of settler colonial orders that seek to govern and control. So breaking those apart are also.
I think part of that, the breaking apart, is letting go of the need to know, of the need to classify and know at all, because we don't always need to know where something came from. I think about the Chaco ancestors at the museum, and but then I also think about the ads on Facebook for like ancestry programs, and I know it's extraordinarily painful for many people who don't know their ancestry because of disruptions, because of migrations, forced migration, that they may not know where they come from, and that can be incredibly healing. But at the same time, I come from a place where I don't think that that knowledge needs to be shared with everybody, and some things should be secret, some things should be belonging to our communities alone. And I acknowledge that strange pull between wanting to know who you are and the loss of knowing who you are, but also wanting to keep that knowledge safe for oneself, and it doesn't have to be in an archive.
Nicole, I'm wondering if you could share something in relation to this, in relation to your ongoing language learning, like language learning and poetry, and what Colette and Jane just spoke of.
Sure. It's interesting you ask that, because I've been thinking a lot about that work, but learning, the work of learning a language, and all of the ways to do that. So in this time I've been learning on Zoom, I've been taking these classes that I'm now able to take part in, these language tables back home in Minneapolis that I haven't ever been able to attend. But then I'm thinking, in relationship to language, I'm thinking about how a lot of the way you learn is through first speakers or elders. And a lot of the times those come from recordings, and how I think about like my experience with archives. I think about oral history, right? I think of recorded sound, but I don't think of those recordings as something that feel archival because they're alive. I feel like they are, the relationship from like the recording to the learner is, that feels inherent, and it takes it out of this idea or this thing that we call the archive in the English language. To me, that feels like such a clinical term. It feels cold, it feels inanimate, but these recordings don't feel that way. And I'm specifically thinking of a word in Anishinaabe, Oshkabewis. It means like knowledge keeper, or somebody who's like in training. And there's actually a language journal that has the same name that is edited, I think, by Anton Troyer, or was. It comes out of Bemidji State. Anyhow, they have like, there's recordings that go along with the different stories that the elders tell, both in English and in Anishinaabe. So I'm just thinking about that, and how I'm thinking about how those recordings fit into this idea of archive, or if they need to. They are, to me, they feel like something different, and they feel alive and activated. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Something about what you just said reminded me, and forgive me, I forget which essay or book this was part of. Maybe it was, I think you'll remember, I think one of you will remember, but where there's a discussion about saving food, like where will you store your food? And the response was, yeah, I store that in the belly of my neighbor. we share, and then more grows from that, right? I mean, I'm somebody please help me, because I'm forgetting the crux of that. I mean, I think that was the crux of the story, but I'm forgetting where it came from. But
Emily, I think it was in Dr. Kimmer's essay about the service berries, where she's talking about Brazil.
Yeah. Something about how you just spoke about language and about the livingness, and that makes me think again about home. And about, questioning this need to store or remove or hoard, and rather what are the best care practices of sharing. And maybe that is, I think, like you said, Colette, like sometimes we don't need to know, and maybe sometimes we don't need to predetermine. Like it probably doesn't matter if anyone ever sees a video of any of my dance works, right? But what matters maybe is that a relationship was formed at one point at a gathering, and that something has continued from there, and then from there, and then from there, and so like how do we think about and how do we value, sometimes how do we value what we don't know is coming, right? Or like, how do we value creating enough openness, maybe, where some things can remain predetermined, where living things can have their own living objects, living things, living relationships can determine their own pathways.
I guess I'm thinking now about how those recordings of elders speaking, those are the archives that support the future, right? They're made because once those elders pass, we won't be able to hear the language as it was from these first speakers. It's a gift to have this knowledge, to hear these words, to be passed down. And I think that when we're thinking about like dance archiving or your archive, Emily, like how do we configure it so there's like this ongoingness, this connection to somebody in the future, or even like Colette and I coming across Polygon Allen's work in the archive, me coming to Diane Burns's work in the archive. I'm not sure where I'm going here, but I feel like it's somehow connected. That these things are gifts in a way.
My colleagues call them in Passamaquoddy gifts from the ancestors. That they are gifts from the ancestors, and that they travel to these moments in order to be gifts for futures. But I think something that's really important there is that they're not for everybody. They're not, this kind of idea of openness and making them available to the entire world. They're not gifts for, they're very specific and very particular, and that's where there needs to be care and responsibility and obligation around that. That's where the care comes in. So this kind of like idea, for instance, that all these sound recordings are going to be in the public domain and are going to be released and everyone can have access to them at any time. And the reality that then people will use them in ways that aren't responsible and aren't respectful. but they're not for everybody. And I think there's a tension that that the settler colonial logics put in play by having the hoards and the accumulation and the enormity of the collections within institutions, is that these are for everybody to access whenever they want. And then there's actually, that's not actually the protocol. And how do you bring those indigenous protocols into these spaces that can moderate that excessive and unnuanced idea of openness?
I think ultimately it's a conversation about consent.
So it's maybe that, and I know that we're kind of running into the time here, but maybe that kind of that decolonial archive is an archive of relations and consent.
I think that's a incredible place to come to this point too together, and something that we can all continue with forward and from. And I'm wondering if as we close in these last few minutes, and with everything that we've shared, yeah, if maybe as a way of saying goodbye for now, if we could each share something that we're working on, yeah, that we're hopeful for, that we're thinking about in relation to to or adjacent to decolonial archives, to this consent, to these relations. Yeah. I'll share because it's coming. In addition to this ongoing work with you all, which I'm just so grateful for. For something I'm making now, I'm in collaboration with Drew Michael, who's a Yupik and he a Yupik mask maker, and we had a conversation yesterday, and I guess I'm just thinking about what I shared at the beginning of this conversation, and then just thinking with him about creating a mask, and thinking about this mask in relation to the masks and the ancestors I've met, and I'm hopeful for, you know, I'm hopeful for this relationship with Drew, and with this making, and with the way in which the knowledge that he has, and the knowledge that he has in relation to making this sacred and like vessel portal of like, I imagine what we make is a portal to futures, which will relate to the past. And I'm very curious, and I'm really really excited about what that will bring forth, especially in relationship to my my meetings with ancestors, and also with my my auntie, who the first artist who I knew, she made masks, and she was a potter, and she made masks out of clay, and so she worked with form and function in a very different way with masks. And so in a way, I feel like I'll be visiting with her and what she was bringing forth into the world too. Excited about that.
I'll just quickly finish by saying it's just been so wonderful to have this conversation with you guys, and I am just looking forward to the many, many more that we'll be able to have. But I guess the project that I am so tied to at the moment is thinking about what changes when Indigenous protocols are brought into the archive, and what happens when Indigenous rights and interests are there from the beginning, not there as something that comes later, but there in the making from the moment that something is created. And how does that shift and change those responsibilities, those obligations, those relationships of care that are necessary and central to any kind of future that is equitable and it is and that can be shared together.
I'll just quickly go. I'm excited to continue our work together. Our reading groups have been really great, and I hope to connect more with Jane too, and just looking forward to thinking together with all of you.
I'm also looking forward to continuing in relation with the three of you. And also, I heard I'm going to be able to go home in a few weeks to my homeland. And I'm looking forward, because of my language study during the pandemic, to be able to speak my first words and that I've learned anew in this language on my homelands.
Oh, such a joy to be spending this time with you all. And oh my gosh, really, 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 really grateful. And I'd like to invite Candice back here with us.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Jane, Colette, and Nicole, for everything that you shared with us today. And thank you, everybody who's watching, who's viewing, who's attending, for just being present and being active in the chat. A final thank you to our funders, our sponsors, and of course, Michelle Robinson from Viscardi Center, and Emilio Garcia and Michael Barrios from LC Interpreting Services for their invaluable support today. Right after this, we're going to head over to the session follow-up chat if you want to continue talking about what we shared here amongst yourselves. And in terms of what's next on this symposium day, you can continue to experience everything. You can visit sponsors in the exhibitor hall. You can create virtual meetups and online conversations at the community section. You can message other attendees and engage with the symposium thematic guides in the digital program book, which you can find on the Hoover platform. Today's education thematic guide was curated by Maura Donahue, who will also be leading the daily debrief session that we will have right after this, where you can synthesize everything that you've experienced from last night's keynote to today to right now. You can go to the Hoover agenda section to find the daily debrief event. Once that is over, we have a dance break led by Zave Marto Harjono. So you can get yourself moving in their Resiliency Moves class. And then we have a virtual expo showcase where a few of the exhibitors will go live with info sessions about their organizations. The last thing that will happen today is our final keynote entitled A Reckoning of Power, Accountability, and Gender Equity. Leading this conversation is the editor-in-chief at Dance Teacher and Dance Business Weekly and the senior consulting editor of Dance Magazine, Lauren Wingenroth, joined by Lady Crow, Linda LaBeija, Jamal Barnes, and Leslie Scott. So have a great time. I hope you enjoy whatever you get into, and we'll see you tonight for our final keynote. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for joining today's sessions. A special thanks to our funders, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Howard Gilman Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. A special thanks to our lead sponsor, Con Edison, and our lead dance advocate, Jody Gottfried Arnhold. Subsidies for the education and dance worker ticket tiers are made possible by the Arnhold Foundation. A special thanks to our host and partner level sponsors, Nell Shelby Productions, Gibney, In the Lights, and New York Live Arts. And last, but certainly not least, a special thanks to our justice, equity, and inclusion partners, Art Beyond Sight, Art Space Sanctuary, Asian American Arts Alliance, Center for Traditional Music and Dance, Indo-American Arts Council, the International Association of Blacks in Dance, Lotus Music and Dance, Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium, National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, New York Foundation for the Arts, and Women of Color in the Arts. Up next, at 2:30, take a short break. At 2:45, join us for our daily debrief. At 3:45, move your bodies in our daily dance break. At 4:15, visit the virtual expo showcase. And at 5:30, we'll circle back for our keynote conversation. Stay connected with us by posting your takeaways on social media using the hashtags DanceSimp, DanceNYC 2021, and DanceSimp 2021. Explore the Whova features by building your agenda of sessions, connecting with other attendees, joining community conversations, and visiting the exhibitor hall. And don't forget to check out our 2021 Symposium digital program book with curated thematic guides. How are we doing? Did you like a session? Use the like feature on your favorite session. Got feedback for us? Take the post-event survey after March 20th and tell us how we did. Need help? Email us at customerservice@dance.nyc. A special thanks to our video asset and streaming partners, Renegade Performance Group, Full Out Creative, and Nell Shelby Productions. Thanks for joining. Keep in touch at dance.nyc.